Today's subject, I think it's safe to say, continues to fascinate and frighten, maybe in equal measure. We're going inside the mind of Ted Bundy and trying to make sense of how someone whose charisma and charm by all accounts were very real hid a truly horrifying reality.
It really is a case that, challenges, I think fundamentally challenges our understanding of human nature. How can someone who was capable of such incredible cruelty also be, simultaneously seen as likable? Even, some people described him as charming.
Yeah, and it's that dissonance, I think, that unsettling contrast that we're really grappling with today. We've got, stacks of psychological profiles, biographical accounts. We even have some of Bundy's own words, and we're going to try to make sense of it all.
I think, what makes Bundy in particular so fascinating from a psychological perspective is that his case seems to defy easy categorization. This wasn't, just an ogre, a monster lurking in the shadows. He was the guy next door, the seemingly charming law student, a volunteer at a suicide hotline.
It's almost the ultimate irony, right? To think that someone who would later confess to taking so many lives had at one point volunteered, offered support to those who are struggling with their own. It's really that duality, the allure and the abhorrent, all kind of intertwined. I think that's really where we have to start to even begin to try to understand this.
Absolutely, and to really try to wrap our heads around Bundy's crimes, we need to try to understand the man himself. And I think a good place to begin with that is his childhood. Now, when we look at the source material, there are some conflicting accounts of what Bundy's early life was actually like.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. What are we talking about specifically?
So some of what we've read suggests a very troubled upbringing. There's mention of a grandfather who was allegedly violent towards family members, even animals. And it really, when you read these accounts, it raises the question, was Bundy in some way predisposed to violence because of his environment? Did he, in a sense, learn it at a very young age?
Right. It's sort of that age-old debate, right?
Right.
Nature versus nurture.
Exactly, but, and here's where it gets even more complex, because Bundy himself claimed to have had a relatively normal childhood, even going so far as to express fondness for that same grandfather.
So then, which version of events are we to believe? I mean, how do you even begin to parse that?
And that, in and of itself, is one of the many enigmas surrounding Ted Bundy, because it's almost impossible to separate truth from fabrication, even when you have, seemingly reliable sources, firsthand accounts, things like that.
Yeah, that's got to be a challenge for experts, I imagine, right? To try to piece together an accurate psychological profile when you're dealing with such potentially unreliable narration.
It certainly adds a layer of complexity, to say the least. However, what we can glean from different pieces of information that we do have is that Bundy's transformation, and I think it's fair to call it a transformation, really seemed to begin after his first love, a woman named Diane Edwards, broke off their relationship.
Okay, so are we talking about a classic case here of heartbreak turning into something far more sinister?
Potentially, and many experts do seem to believe that this rejection, this loss of control that Bundy experienced when that relationship ended, it really became a defining moment for him, kind of pushing him down this path of increasingly disturbing behavior.
Because it wasn't just the brutality of his crimes that shocked the world. It was the method, it was the chilling, calculated way in which he chose his victims.
It wasn't random, right? This wasn't just, a crime of opportunity. This wasn't a case of random violence. Bundy very meticulously planned his attacks, and it's really quite frightening when you think about it. He often targeted young women in very familiar settings, places where they should have felt safe, places that, anyone would feel comfortable. And I think in a way that made them all the more vulnerable.
It's like he weaponized that sense of security in a way, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Feigning injuries, using a fake cast or a sling to appear harmless, even to evoke sympathy from people. It's really quite chilling when you think about it.
Oh, absolutely. And it really does speak to a really profound understanding of human psychology on some level, right? It's like a manipulation almost of societal expectations. He knew, what buttons to push. He knew how to exploit, that kind of natural inclination that we all have, that most people have, I should say, to want to help those in need.
And it wasn't just, appearing helpless. He even impersonated, authority figures, police officers, people that, again, you're almost conditioned to trust. It's like he was playing a role, becoming whoever he needed to be in that moment to lure them in.
Yeah. And that's such a crucial point, I think, because Bundy's ability to just blend in, to appear completely ordinary, I think is really, one of the most chilling aspects of this case. And it really, I think, forces us to confront this disturbing truth about human nature, that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a smile, it carries a fake badge, and it uses those things to disarm people.
Which brings us, I think, to the question that's been debated by experts for decades now. What exactly was going on inside Bundy's mind? I mean, are we talking, was he a sociopath? Was it psychopathy? Was it something else entirely?
It's a really complex question. And, the sources that we've been digging through offer some fascinating insights. Look at someone like Hervey Cleckley, a very prominent psychiatrist, really known for his work on psychopathy. And he might have pointed to some of the things that we've been discussing: the superficial charm, the lack of empathy, a complete absence of remorse as classic, kind of hallmarks of that disorder.
So are we talking about, an individual who is almost kind of hardwired for this kind of behavior, just lacking that fundamental capacity for empathy that most of us take for granted?
That's certainly one school of thought, but then you have sociologists like Jack Levin, who studied Bundy extensively, and his argument is that Bundy was more likely a sociopath.
Wait, so what's the difference? I mean, I'll be honest, I always get a little fuzzy on the distinction between the two.
Yeah, and it's a really common point of confusion. To put it as simply as I can, psychopathy is often seen as a more innate kind of condition, something that might be linked to, brain abnormalities, things of that nature. Sociopathy, on the other hand, is thought to stem more from environmental factors. So we're talking about things like, severe childhood trauma, neglect, things of that nature.
So we've got nature versus nurture rearing its head again.
Exactly. And I think, in Bundy's case, there's evidence to potentially support both sides of this. He certainly displayed a lot of the classic psychopathic traits. But at the same time, we can't ignore those conflicting reports about his childhood and the very real possibility that some early trauma may have really shaped, his development in a profound way.
And then you have the whole entity thing, right?
Yeah.
These claims that Bundy made, that he heard a voice, that there was this voice that was urging him to commit these horrific acts. I mean, surely that has to point to some form of, mental illness, right?
It's certainly possible, and some have interpreted it as a sign of, schizophrenia or some other form of, psychotic disorder.
But wouldn't that kind of contradict, this whole idea of his crimes being so calculated, so methodical?
It's a compelling point, and I think it's important to remember that, above all else, Ted Bundy was a master manipulator. He knew how to play the system. He knew how to say, I think, what he thought people wanted to hear in a given situation to achieve a certain end.
So this entity, this voice, it could have been a way to, deflect responsibility, to kind of paint himself as a victim of forces that were beyond his control.
Exactly. And when you look at, his history of deception, his tendency to tailor his story depending on who his audience was, it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, I think, to really discern what, if anything, that he said was genuine.
So how do we, I mean, if we're trying to understand the motivations behind his actions, how do we even begin to piece together, what's authentic, what's manipulation? Where do you even begin with that?
Well, one framework that emerges, I think, from a lot of the research is what's known as the dark triad. It's this cluster of personality traits that when they're found together can be incredibly dangerous. So we're talking about narcissism, Machiavellianism, and of course, psychopathy.
Okay, and we've touched on psychopathy, but how did those other two traits, the narcissism and the Machiavellianism, how did those manifest in Bundy's behavior?
So narcissism, it's characterized by this really grandiose sense of self-importance. There's a need for admiration. There's often a lack of empathy. And, Bundy, he clearly craved attention. He saw himself as superior to others, even going so far as to really revel in his notoriety. And I think this is something that you see with certain types of criminals, especially those that become these, almost larger than life figures.
And Machiavellianism.
So that really speaks to his manipulative nature. Bundy was cunning, he was strategic, and he was very much willing to exploit others to achieve his own goals. He was a master manipulator, I think we've established that, who used his charm, who used his deception to get what he wanted. And he often, really preyed on on people's good nature, their willingness to trust, which is, again, one of the more disturbing aspects of all of this.
And there seems to be, when you look at everything that he said, everything that we know, there just seemed to be this complete lack of remorse for his actions. Almost, I don't know, like he took a perverse pride in it, in a way.
Yes, and it brings us to that very chilling quote from Bundy himself. He said, "I am the most cool-hearted son of a bitch you will ever meet."
It's like this tiny window into the darkest recesses of his mind,
Yeah.
Even knowing what we know now, about his tendency to manipulate, to kind of fabricate. I mean, that level of, I don't know, like self-awareness, that chilling lack of remorse, it's really bone-chilling.
And it speaks to this key question, I think, that we grapple with when we study individuals like this. Did his upbringing, did these potential disorders dictate his actions, or did he have a choice?
That age-old debate of free will versus determinism, right?
Precisely. And while we may never have a definitive answer, I think, exploring these questions allows us to delve into, the real complexities of human behavior and the factors that can lead to these kinds of horrifying acts.
And one factor, of course, that Bundy himself pointed to was the role of pornography in his crimes. He went so far as to suggest that it was a catalyst for his actions.
Which, again, this is another area where the sources offer a real, I think, range of perspectives on this. You have some experts who completely dismiss it. They see it as just another, sort of manipulative attempt to deflect responsibility. And then you have others who say, no, there is some merit to this idea that pornography can exacerbate pre-existing tendencies towards violence.
So it's not, like you watch this and then you go out and commit a crime, right? There's got to be more to it. It's more nuanced than just a simple, cause and effect situation.
Right. It's way more complex than that. And, it's probably more accurately, this really, really complex interplay of different factors. And, while pornography might have played some role in, shaping his fantasies and things like that, I think when you look at it, the sources really do seem to suggest that it wasn't this sole determining factor in his crimes.
And it's interesting, too, because in the documentary Dark Triad, Bundy actually contradicts his own earlier claims.
Yeah.
There's this really kind of chilling moment where he kind of flat out says, "I never said pornography made me do it.
Yeah.
I said that to get them to help me. I did it because I wanted to do it."
It's a very, very disturbing admission, and I think it really aligns with this chilling pattern that we see throughout Bundy's life. This just deep-seated need for control. His crimes, I think, weren't just about the act of violence itself. They were about dominating his victims, about exerting his power over them in really the most horrific way imaginable.
And it wasn't even, just when they were alive, right? I mean, we know that Bundy engaged in necrophilia, often spending, we've read accounts of him spending hours with his victims' bodies after death.
Yes, and this is where the conversation, I think, becomes even more unsettling, because it wasn't enough for Bundy to take a life, but he needed to control his victims even in death, it's a really, really disturbing concept to wrap your head around. He would dress them up, he would apply makeup, almost as if he was trying to create this macabre fantasy world where he had, absolute and total control.
It's like you're trying to mold them into, some kind of idealized image, which some experts suggest might even connect back to Diane Edwards, to his first love.
It's a fascinating theory, and it's one that several of the sources, do touch upon. Many of Bundy's victims shared a very similar physical appearance with Edwards, specifically, the long, dark hair parted down the middle. And so it's almost as if, subconsciously he was trying to recreate this lost love, but in a way that I think, reflected the darkness that had really come to consume him.
It's incredible, or maybe incredible is the wrong word, but it's striking how this need for control, this desire to maintain this very carefully constructed persona extended far beyond his crimes. I mean, the fact that Bundy was able to live this seemingly normal life for so long, all the while committing these horrific atrocities, it's mind-boggling.
He wasn't, some recluse, living on the fringes of society. This is someone who was engaged, who went to law school, he volunteered at a suicide hotline like we talked about. It's a stark reminder, I think, that evil can and often does hide in plain sight, often disguised as, as normalcy, as someone you'd never suspect.
Which I think has to beg the question, right? Could someone like Bundy even exist today? I mean, in the age of, online dating, social media, that we have the dark web, all these different things. I mean, could a modern day Bundy exploit these tools to find victims, to manipulate, to deceive, perhaps even more effectively than Bundy himself was able to?
It's a chilling thought, but I think it's an important one to consider. Bundy's case really forces us, I think, to confront this unsettling reality that even in a world that's, increasingly interconnected in ways that, Bundy himself, I think, couldn't even imagine, that, darkness can still lurk beneath the surface, often undetected.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder to, I think, for all of us, to be vigilant, to be aware of, those subtle signs of manipulation and control, to trust our instincts, when something feels off.
Because as we've seen in this deep dive, I think the most unsettling truth about Ted Bundy isn't, the brutality of his crimes, as awful as they were, but this unsettling realization that someone capable of such darkness could exist so close to home, hidden in plain sight.
It's a haunting reminder that the line between good and evil is often, it's not clearly defined. It can be very blurred, and that, sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones that we least suspect.